The memory of that day is etched into my mind like a scar I can't erase, though it happened years ago. I was barely 20, fragile in body and perhaps foolishly in heart. The doctors had called it an emergency, a rare congenital heart defect that could claim my life if not treated immediately. I remember the cold, sterile smell of the hospital, the antiseptic stinging my nose, the harsh fluorescent lights glaring down as though they were accusing me of something I hadn't done. I was scared, trembling, and desperate, and I needed them, my parents, the two people who had promised to protect me, to love me unconditionally. I dialed their numbers, my fingers shaking as I pressed the keys. "Mom and Dad, it's urgent. I need you. The doctor said it's life. Threatening, please come." I repeated the words several times, my voice cracking, pleading, but the line went silent. I tried again and again. Hours passed, each call ended the same way, ignored, unanswered, leaving me stranded in a world where love should have been unconditional, but was clearly absent. At first, I tried to reason with myself. Maybe Dad was in a meeting, Mom running errands, perhaps they were on their way. But the hours stretched into an eternity, and the sterile walls of the hospital room began to feel like a prison. The nurse, a gentle woman with kind eyes, whispered softly, "We can't wait any longer. You'll have to sign yourself in for surgery." Panic gripped me, not just the fear of dying, but the deeper, more insidious terror of being abandoned by those who were supposed to care the most. I remember the operating room vividly, the cold metal, the blinding lights, the steady beep of the heart monitor. I fought to stay calm, but the fear was suffocating. I was wheeled onto the table, and as the anesthesiologist's calm voice explained what would happen, I realized the painful truth. The people I had loved the most had chosen their convenience over my life, and in that moment, I hated them not violently, not angrily, but with the deep, steady resentment of someone betrayed. When I woke groggy and weak, the relief of survival was mingled with a burning anger. I had survived the surgery, but I had also survived their absence, their betrayal, and their indifference. My recovery was a long, lonely process. Nights were sleepless, each ache and scar a reminder of their failure. Every time I felt pain, I thought of the calls I had made, the desperate words I had spoken into an empty line. They had chosen to ignore me when I was at my most vulnerable, and no apology could erase that. For months, I avoided them. Their calls went unanswered, their texts deleted, their presence blocked from my life. When they tried to contact me, their apologies felt hollow, perfunctory, like rehearsed lines delivered to a stranger rather than a child they had nearly lost. And yet the betrayal gave me something fierce, a burning determination. If they wouldn't be there for me, I would learn to be there for myself. The anger, the hurt, and the abandonment became fuel for transformation. I threw myself into my studies, my work, and anything that could build me into someone they could never dismiss again. I didn't just want to survive. I wanted to thrive, to rise above the betrayal, to make them realize, one day, the cost of their neglect. And as I lay in bed that night, staring at the sterile ceiling, a quiet voice whispered to me, one day they would come to my door. And when they did, I would be ready. The days after my recovery were like stepping into a new world, one I had to navigate alone. At first, it was terrifying. The quiet apartment felt emptier than the hospital room, and every creak of the floorboards reminded me that the people who were supposed to protect me had failed completely. But slowly, something inside me began to stir, a quiet, stubborn determination that I would not just survive. I would rebuild. I surrounded myself with people who actually cared. Friends became my family. Mentors and colleagues became the pillars I could lean on. I learned the value of those who chose to be there, not out of obligation, not because I was their child, but because they genuinely cared. Their presence filled the void my parents left, and I discovered that love could be found in unexpected places. Physically, I healed. The surgery had saved my life, and I took every precaution to make sure my heart remained strong. I exercised, I ate well, and I followed every doctor's order meticulously. But the healing of the heart that pumps blood is nothing compared to the healing of the heart that bears scars from emotional betrayal. That, I realized, would take far longer. I poured myself into work, into school, into mastering skills and knowledge that would make me independent. Every success was a quiet rebellion against the neglect I had suffered. Every small triumph, raising my GPA, securing a promotion, buying my first apartment, was a reminder that I no longer needed them. I had become my own savior, my own guardian, and that realization gave me a strength I had never known before. And yet, beneath the surface, a deeper fire smoldered. Anger, yes, but not the kind that destroys from within. It was calculated, quiet, and powerful. I remembered every detail, the coldness in their voices, the dismissive excuses, the way they had acted as if my life wasn't urgent. I catalogued each memory, each slight, like a ledger of betrayal. It wasn't bitterness that consumed me, it was clarity. I had survived because of myself, and now they would one day see that survival reflected in my success. By the third year, I had transformed. I traveled to cities I had once only dreamed of. I met people who inspired me, people who believed in me, people who lifted me up when I couldn't yet lift myself. I built a network of support, a home filled with laughter and warmth, a life that radiated independence. They had tried to ignore me at my weakest, and now I was unstoppable. The fifth year brought the culmination of my efforts. I had achieved financial security, built a thriving career, and earned respect in my community. I was no longer the frightened, vulnerable young adult they had abandoned in that hospital bed. I had grown, and my life had become a fortress they could no longer breach, and yet I knew the reckoning would come. I could feel it in the quiet moments when I reflected on their betrayal. One day, they would come back, because pride and guilt are heavier than any denial. And when they did, I would not be the frightened child who called desperately for help. I would be the woman who had survived, who had thrived, and who held all the power. I started to imagine that day not with cruelty, but with anticipation. The thought of them standing at my door, soaked in regret, humbled, desperate, gave me a strange satisfaction. It was not about revenge in the traditional sense. It was about justice, about the universe finally balancing itself. And so I continued to build, continued to grow, continued to shine. Each step forward was a promise to myself. I would never be ignored again. I would never be powerless again. And one day, when they came, I would decide the terms not out of malice, but out of the quiet strength that comes from surviving the unimaginable. It happened on a gray, rainy evening, the kind of rain that makes streets shimmer and people hurry, heads down, wishing to disappear. I was in my apartment, curled up on the couch with a book, enjoying the quiet I had fought so hard to build for myself. The soft hum of the heater and the faint smell of coffee created a cocoon of warmth and safety. I was finally at peace in the life I had painstakingly constructed. Then the doorbell rang. Startled, I set the book aside, my pulse quickening. I wasn't expecting anyone. Friends rarely visited unannounced, and strangers certainly didn't knock at my door. Something in my gut told me this wasn't ordinary. I approached the door cautiously, peering through the peephole, and froze. There they were, my parents. Standing in the pouring rain, clothes soaked through, hair plastered to their foreheads. Their faces were pale, worn, and unmistakably humbled. The sight of them, the people who had abandoned me in my darkest hour, brought a strange mix of emotions, anger, disbelief, and a simmering anticipation. They looked smaller somehow, fragile, as if life itself had humbled them. I opened the door just slightly, keeping my expression neutral. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice steady, calm, and carefully measured. My mother's eyes filled with tears instantly. My father's lips trembled, and he avoided my gaze. We were wrong," he stammered. We didn't understand. Please, we want to make amends." I studied them silently, letting the weight of their presence and their guilt settle in the room. I thought of the countless nights I had spent alone, recovering from surgery without a single word of concern from the two people who should have been there. I thought of every unanswered call, every empty promise, every excuse they had given themselves while I fought for my life. "What do you want?" I asked finally, my tone firm but controlled, not angry, not weak, firm. I wanted them to feel the gravity of the moment. Tears streamed down my mother's face. My father swallowed hard and muttered, We want to be part of your life again. Please forgive us. We were foolish. We were blind. I let them falter under the weight of their own guilt. I didn't interrupt. I didn't comfort. I didn't cry. Instead, I allowed them to experience the consequences of their neglect. The quiet powerlessness that comes when someone you wronged finally stands unshakable before you. I stepped back and invited them in, but only just far enough that they couldn't sit fully. They shivered in the cold air of the apartment, and I noticed the way they hesitated, unsure of the boundaries now between us. "Do you know what it feels like?" I asked softly, to call for help and be ignored, to face the possibility of death alone, while the people you trust most remain silent, their heads bowed lower. They said nothing, and in their silence, the truth was clear. My survival had become a mirror reflecting the neglect they had inflicted. I could see the regret etched into every line of their faces, and for the first time I realized that power had shifted entirely. I was no longer the frightened child. They were at my mercy now, and as they looked up, pleading, I felt a quiet, profound satisfaction. I had survived, I had thrived, and now I could let them see without words, without cruelty, the consequences of their betrayal. I let them step inside, but only just. The smell of rain clung to their clothes, the trembling in their hands betrayed their nerves, and the guilt in their eyes was unmistakable. I led them into the living room, deliberately keeping a distance between us. The space I had built for myself, the home, the warmth, the sanctuary, was mine alone, and now it became the stage for the reckoning they had long deserved. I sank into the armchair opposite them, letting them fidget under my gaze. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, as if the room itself were holding its breath. Then I spoke not with anger, not with malice, but with the calm, steady authority of someone who had survived the unimaginable. "Do you know why I didn't call you after my surgery?" I asked, my voice quiet yet precise. "Because you ignored me when I needed you most. You were given a chance to be there for your child, and you chose convenience, indifference, silence." They flinched at my words, my mother pressing her hand over her mouth, as if to hold back a sob. My father's jaw tightened, and his hands gripped each other so hard the knuckles turned white. I allowed the tension to hang in the air. I let them feel the weight of the betrayal, the consequences of the years they had abandoned me. I began to recount my journey, not to boast, but to make them see. I told them about the nights I spent alone in that hospital bed, the sleepless nights of recovery, the fears I had buried deep so I could function. I told them about every triumph they had missed, every milestone I had achieved without them, the apartment I had bought, the career I had built, the friends and mentors who had become my family. Every word was deliberate, each story a mirror reflecting the life they had chosen to ignore. They listened, powerless, ashamed. Their eyes were wide, wet, desperate, and I realized something profound. True revenge is not in humiliation or cruelty. It is in thriving despite betrayal. The power had shifted completely. The child they abandoned was now the person who held the power to define their presence in her life. Finally, I spoke the choice aloud. "You may witness my life, but you do not get to dictate it. You may offer apologies, but reconciliation is not guaranteed. You may feel regret, but it is your burden to carry. I survived without you. I thrived without you. Now you will learn to see me as I am, not as you wished I would be." Tears rolled down my mother's cheeks. My father's shoulders sagged in surrender. I offered them small kindnesses, a cup of tea, a chair to sit on, but I drew the line firmly. I would not let them erase the past. I would not let them forget. They were guests in a world they had once abandoned, and they would feel the consequences of their actions. Over the following weeks, I let them re-enter my life cautiously. Every interaction was measured. They begged for connection, for forgiveness, for a place in my thriving world. And every time, I reminded myself and them that nothing would come for free. Respect had to be earned. Trust had to be rebuilt. The lesson was theirs to learn, slowly and painfully. In the end, I realized that the sweetest revenge was not in causing pain. It was in showing the power of survival, independence, and resilience. My parents had begged at my door, humbled and desperate, and I had emerged unbroken, strong, and untouchable. The child they abandoned had grown into a woman who did not need them, but had chosen, on her own terms, to teach them humility. And as I looked at their bowed heads, the weight of years of neglect finally sinking in, I smiled quietly. I had survived, I had thrived, and for the first time I felt the complete, unshakable satisfaction of justice.